Well, the next topic, we can talk about our next favourite longitudinal survey, which is the HILDA survey, obviously. We all love a good HILDA. And the presenter is, as I don't think we need much of an introduction, the esteemed Smith and Weatherburn from the University of New South Wales, who's going to talk us about stress, risky alcohol use and violence against women. Cool.
Well, after Kathy this morning and Kristen just now, I don't know there's too much left for me to say, but I'll give it my best shot. That was a fabulous presentation, Christine. A bit of background, some of you, of course, maybe most of you are familiar with an estimated close to 200,000 women each year in Australia are over the age of 18 are physically assaulted. Nearly 80% of these assaults are committed by men known to the victim. And about half of the women that are surveyed, this is from the Personal Safety Survey report, who have been assaulted report that alcohol or drugs contributed to the assault. And at this point, I just want to emphasise the points that Kathy was making this morning are really apt here. It really is time that people working in different disciplines on essentially the same topic got together and worked more cohesively. Most of the research that's been done on the basis of which people have claimed a relationship between alcohol use and violence, though, has come from cross-sectional surveys and surveys of the drinking on the part of the male or the offender rather than the victim. Of course, the obvious question is, why would you focus on alcohol use by the victim? Well, I just should say right at the outset that it's certainly not because alcohol consumption by the victim provides any excuse for violence against women, and it's certainly not because what women say or do when intoxicated provides any justification for violence against them. It's partly because if you want to understand violence against women, you need to look at both the victim and the offender, partly because heavy drinking may be a response to violence rather than simply a cause of it, and partly because when you look at the evidence, it's fairly contradictory. There are a small number of studies which have found an association between alcohol use and violence against women, but most of them are cross-sectional and are therefore vulnerable to what economists would call omitted variable bias, in other words, or what psychologists probably understand as confounding. Some factor not controlled for in their analyses is responsible for the association, or more commonly a problem of endogeneity. In other words, the problem is not a case of going from alcohol use to violence, but the other way around. It's violence that's leading to alcohol abuse. So the current study is designed to improve on past research by looking at a large nationally representative longitudinal sample. And we're going to be using a fixed effect panel design, and I'll say a bit more about that shortly. It's a 22-year follow-up, so basically we're looking at a bunch of people who've been followed for the last 22 years, or not all of them, but some of them have been followed for 22 years. It's representative. And we're looking at a measure of alcohol consumption in terms of intoxication rather than risky drinking when looking at the effect of alcohol on violence, and risky drinking when we're doing it the other way around. And I'll try to say a bit more about that later on. Okay, in addition to that, we're going to look at lagged effects. In other words, does the experience of drinking alcohol in one year have an effect on violence the subsequent year, and vice versa? And we're going to look at whether or not there are reverse effects, whether or not, for example, being a victim of violence has the effect of leading a person to engage in risky drinking. One thing I should say right at the outset is that the HILDA survey which we use is not capable of distinguishing between intimate partner violence or family violence and violence against women that might occur in a pub or a club or anything like that. So that's a limitation I'll also come back to. And by the way, I forgot to acknowledge my co-author, Sarah Rahman, I know is in the States, but is Joanna here in the audience? Ah, there you are, Joanna. My credit to you. Okay, so the current study just asks two simple questions. Does the risk of violence against a woman increase with alcohol use? And does becoming a victim of violence increase the likelihood of risky drinking? So what's our methods? I'm using waves 2 to 21 of the Household Income and Labour Dynamics Survey. That gives us 143,517 responses from around about 15 to 16,000 individuals over a 19-year period. The response rate for HILDA is fantastic. It was 86.9% in the first year, but it's remained above 90% in all subsequent waves. So the dependent variables in the analysis, violence is coded 1 if the respondent reports being a victim of physical violence in the last 12 months and 0 otherwise. That is a crude measure, and as you pointed out, Kristen, it's much better to have more subtle measures, which we don't have in HILDA. Alcohol use in the HILDA is categorised into 8 different categories, from don't drink through to drinking 13 plus standard drinks. This is at a particular sitting. So there are 2 questions in HILDA. One deals with how frequently you drink. The other one deals with how much you drink when you sit down on a particular occasion to have a drink. And risky drinking, the criterion I'm using here is the National Health and Medical Research Council criterion, which means that if you drink more than 10 standard drinks per week or more than 4 standard drinks in one sitting, you're engaging in risky drinking. That's understood from the standpoint of public health. Okay, the controls, I use a year of interview, number of financial stresses, number of personal stresses, social isolation, marital status, age, education, socioeconomic disadvantage, and whether the respondent is pregnant. I've drawn those controls, with the exception of year of interview, from past studies which have found strong relationships, at least in a cross-sectional survey, between those factors and the risk of violence. So a bit of detail. I won't go through all the covariates because it'd take too long, but you may wonder how, for example, we measure financial stress. It's a composite measure based on responses to questions dealing with, for example, whether you couldn't pay the bills on time, whether you couldn't pay the mortgage or rent on time, whether you've pawned or sold something. The personal stress is whether you've experienced in the last 12 months a serious personal injury or illness, the death of a spouse or child, major worsening in financial situation, and so on. Social isolation is measured in the HILDA in 2 ways. There's 5 negative items, which you can see there, things like people don't come to visit me as often as I'd like, and 5 positive items, including things like I seem to have a lot of friends, there's always someone who can cheer me up. So what we did was flip the positive items around the other way so that we had 10 items, all of which measured the extent of social isolation. So what's the research strategy? Well, first we run GEE logistic regression models on the pooled data just to confirm the results of past cross-sectional studies. Don't worry if you've never heard of GEE, it's not a person. It's simply a means of dealing with correlated observations. If I'm trying to reassure the statisticians amongst you, particularly Joanna, that this is all okay. We do that then looking at the lagged effects. And then finally, and this is what matters most to us, is the fixed effect logistic regression. And I'll say a bit more in a minute about why the fixed effect model is the most important. Then we flip it around and have a look at the effect of assault on risky alcohol use using much the same controls as study 1, but looking at risky alcohol use as the dependent variable. And just to remind you, that's more than 10 standard drinks per week or more than 4 standard drinks in one sitting. So what's a fixed effect panel study and why are they so good? Well, economists and some fellow travellers like me really do like to get at the causal effects of these things. It's very difficult to do that normally, certainly very difficult to do in a cross-sectional study. So what happens in a fixed effect panel study is that you're looking at the covariation between alcohol and violence within a given respondent rather than between respondents. So in a sense, psychologists will understand this as each person serves as their own control. What it means in practical terms is that we control for all time constant factors, regardless of whether we explicitly include them in the model or we don't, which is a really nice way of getting better control over omitted variable bias. It doesn't deal with endogeneity, and I'll come back to that. Okay, so we still need controls for the time-varying influences, and I've mentioned a lot of them earlier on, but we also control for year in case there are any general effects over time of changes in alcohol use or changes in violence. So just a couple of words about the sample description. On the left-hand side, what you've got is the percentage of women who report having been assaulted in the previous 12 months, and I emphasise this is physical assault. And you can see that it started to decline and then started to jump up again over time, so it's good to have that year control. On the right-hand side, you've got the percentage of women engaging in risky drinking. Bear in mind this is a nationally representative sample, so it's a pretty good picture of what's going on. In New South Wales at least, and I think in most other states, you'd all be familiar with the drop in alcohol-related assault starting in around 2008, and then there's been this increase. This busy table is merely a way of showing you how many observations we got for each of the variable values. On the left-hand side in blue, I'm colourblind, I hope it's blue, not purple. Check. Blue? Thank God for that. So in yellow, you've got the total number of observations for each variable value. The 2 tables are the same, they just couldn't fit them on one slide. And we're well represented. on the right-hand side, you've got the number of missing cases, and in some cases it looks like we've got a lot of missing values, for example, with financial stresses, 4,000 odd, but in terms of, in the percentage terms, we've got very low rates of missing values. So bearing this in mind with logistic regression, dropping things list-wise if there's missing values. Okay, so let's just get started to the results, looking first at alcohol's effect on violence against women. This is, bear in mind, this is the cross-sectional part of the story. It will change as we go through. I imagine many of you are unfamiliar with odds ratios. All you need to know about odds ratios is that if they're more than one, the person with that characteristic is at more risk of being of experiencing violence. Less than one, they're lower risk, but only if the p-value, which you can see listed there, is less than 0.05. So just cutting quickly to the chase, for example, a 25 to 54-year-old, comparing that to a woman who's 15 to 24, the odds of that person being assaulted are about 19% less than someone who's 15 to 24. And you can just see down there that as you get older, you're less at risk. If you haven't completed year 11 or year 12, you're more at risk of experiencing violence. If you're disadvantaged, you're more at risk. And if you experience financial stresses, the more of them you have, the more at risk you are. Before I get to the bottom half of the table, let's just jump across and look at the lagged effects, and you can see they're pretty much the same. The only difference here is that in the lagged effects, remember this is going from what happened in 1 year, or you're drinking in 1 year, and its effect on the subsequent year. But the picture is much the same. The odds ratios differ a little bit, but they're all in the same direction. Jumping down to the bottom half of the table, you can see that as the number of personal stresses goes up, as social isolation goes up, you're more at risk. Never being married or in a de facto relationship is a protective factor. You won't be surprised to hear that. Look at the pregnancy result there. You can see they're more at risk, and I think this is what's given rise to this widespread view that women who are pregnant are more at risk of domestic violence. I'm going to show you some results which call that issue into question. But you also see that you can drink 1 to 4 standard drinks and there's no effect on the risk, but as the number of drinks goes up after that, there's more of a risk. None of this is new. This is pretty much just confirming what we've already seen in past cross-sectional studies. And jumping across to the lagged effects, you can see it's pretty much the same story. In other words, the effects, generally speaking, are lasting a year. There's no effect for the 7 to 8 standard drinks, and for some reason, drinking 1 to 2 standard drinks is protective. Work that out if you can. Okay, so going to the fixed effects. Now this is what really matters. Now we've got much better control over omitted variable bias, things we haven't measured. And you can see there's no effect of age, possibly because there's not much variation over time, no effect of school completion, no effect of disadvantage, but the financial stresses is still coming on strong. And if you look at personal stress and social isolation, they're also still having an effect. But if you look at the pregnancy result, you can see that in a fixed effect analysis, it's actually protective, and that's what you'd want to have happen. Standard drinks, it's the same, essentially the same story. So as the number of standard drinks goes up after 4, the person concerned is more at risk of experiencing violence. Is this all going too fast? All okay? Okay. Right, so summarising it all, that's the effect, controlling for all other factors. This is the relationship between the number of drinks you consume and the at a particular setting and the risk of experiencing violence as a woman. You can see a steady rise over that point in time. Well, all of that's okay, and we do have reasonable controls over omitted variable bias. We don't necessarily have any control over whether or not alcohol's causing violence or it's going the other way around. So let's just turn it around now and have a look at the effect of violence on risky drinking. Once again, to remind you, if you're not familiar with odds ratios, if they're less than 1, the person with that characteristic is less at risk of drinking, risky drinking. And you can see that for 25 to 50-year-olds compared with 15 to 24-year-olds, they're about 33% less likely to engage in risky drinking. We all learn from our mistakes. As we get older, we drink less. I'm still learning. If you have not completed year 12, you're less at risk of drinking or engaging in risky drinking, probably because you don't have as much money. And jumping across to, where are we? There we are, the lagged effects. They're pretty much the same sort of effect you can see there. But what we really care about here are the bottom half of the table, you can see that the personal stresses, as they go up, the greater the likelihood of engaging in risky drinking. Pregnancy is a protective factor. But the crucial issue here is that you still look at the victim of violence, you can see the odds ratio is 1.326, it's positive. That means that a person who is a victim of violence is more at risk of engaging in risky drinking. And if you jump across to the lagged effects, you don't see the same sort of effect. Pregnancy is still a protective factor, but you don't see an effect of being a victim of violence on engagement in risky drinking, possibly because the effects don't last, possibly because the woman gets out of that relationship, as you're intimating. I'm hoping to get answers to that in the question time. So looking at the fixed effect results, you can see that there are still protective effects from getting older, the protective effect from not completing Year 12. I'm not recommending that you don't let your kids finish Year 12. It's just a case. I won't even try to explain that. I'm sure you all get it. So as you can see, just looking down at the bottom of the table there, victim of violence is still showing up. And if you're a victim of violence, you're more likely to engage in risky drinking, which is consistent with what Kristen was finding. It's just one small picture of a long-term story about the consequences of violence against women. So that's the difference between the likelihood of engaging in risky drinking between those who've been victims of assault and those who haven't been victims of assault, controlling for all the other factors that I mentioned, and you can see is nearly double the risk of engaging in risky drinking if you're a victim of violence. Okay, just to summarise it all, the risk of physical violence in the last 12 months is about 9% for a woman who consumes 1 to 2 standard drinks at a sitting, jumps to 17% if you go up to 7 to 8 drinks at a sitting, and about 25% for a woman who normally consumes 13 or more standard drinks at a sitting. You may be horrified to think there are people who do drink that much, men and women. It's an amazing, I'd be dead. Controlling for other factors, a woman who reports having been assaulted in the last 12 months is about twice as likely to engage in risky drinking in the last 12 months. Okay, caveats. The number one caveat is endogeneity. We can't really be sure how much of this is a case of alcohol causing violence and how much of it's a case of violence causing risky alcohol use. What we need, and I'll come to this in a second, maybe I'll just leave that. We also have no information on the victim-offender relationship. And I think this is, as Fan said earlier, there may be very different dynamics going on between women who, for example, are assaulted in a pub by someone they don't know, and women who are assaulted in the context of an intimate personal relationship. And we really do need to unpack that to get a better understanding of what's going on. The measurement assumptions, we're relying on self-report. I'm actually more comfortable with that than many other people. I think it's pretty reliable. But we do have a really unsubtle measure of violence in the HILDA. It would be nice to have a much broader range of factors included. Future research, well look, above everything else, we really need to find a variable that influences alcohol use but doesn't have any effect on violence other than through its effect on alcohol use, or as the economists would put it, we really need an instrument to do a decent IV relationship analysis. We don't really know, and I don't know, although I learned a lot this morning from Kathy, why does risky drinking increase the risk of violence? Is it joint drinking sessions? Is it coercive behaviour on the part of the male? Is it greater vulnerability to attack? I think we really need to get to the bottom of that if we're going to devise effective intervention strategies. Other stresses, other questions are financial stress, personal stress, and social isolation, causes or consequences of the violence. Is the drinking a proxy for other factors like family conflict? Would the results be different, as I said, if we were able to separate the different kinds of violence? And I think since I keep pressing and nothing happens, I must have come to the end. So I hope you all, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Don. Question from, yeah, there's one question right in front. Sorry, the mic is coming. I was closer, but I was lazy. I apologise.
Thank you so much, Dawn. I'm mindful that we're in a room of, nerdy researchers, and we kind of get what you're saying, and we're on the journey with you.
Right.
But how do you think, in terms of more public messaging around this, how do we articulate this in a way that it doesn't revert to kind of victim blaming?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, step one, don't put out a press release. And I'm certainly not putting out a press release. Look, I think in a context like this, it's okay, but there is a big risk that people will take that out and once again revert to the old, oh, it's just the drinking, it's all your fault. I don't think, the only way I can think is to simply avoid engaging in tabloid media on the topic, or tabloid television when it comes down to it. But I do think, that said, it is really important to combine the work that's been going on in substance use and the work that's been going on in domestic violence and looking at the whole story, not just part. I mean, the financial stress is part of the story. There's a whole lot to unravel there. But my short answer to your question is don't put out a lot of publicity about it.
Other questions?
Hello, thank you, Don. My name's Jenna, I'm at the back over here.
Where are you?
I'm
right
at the back. I'm Jenna, I'm from Corrective Services. I'm just wondering, obviously your presentation was about alcohol consumption, but in our space we see more drug dependency, and is that something that could be kind of replicated using the same data, or would that be a different data set that would need to be looked at?
Now, HILDA's got some questions on illicit drug use, and I was really interested in looking at the methamphetamine result, but unfortunately they've got alcohol on all 21 or 22 of the waves we were looking at, but they've only got the illicit drug use on a couple of waves. And when Nadine Smith had done earlier work for the Bureau, they only had 8 waves, and you really need those 21 waves, I think, because the percentage risk is actually quite low, at least in the survey. So I could have a look at that, it'd be worth doing, but you'll only get, I think there are 3 surveys with illicit drug use in them. But the survey on violence against the longitudinal women's survey looks like a fantastic resource. Is that got substance use in it?
Yeah, I think so. You'd have to ask Kristen who's at it.
Right, okay. Right.
It would. Can I make a comment on that?
Oh, I was just going to say it would for at least some years, but whether it does every year is something to investigate.
Okay.
It should be on. So, I mean, just to respond to this question about how do you not use this as part of victim blaming, I do think your response is very good there, Don. But I also think there's a real message here for the domestic violence sector and the sector that works with women and domestic violence to say this is your core business. That in fact the substance use is really significant for women in this space, and we should be working with women in this space to address and talk about the substance use issues that they have, because we also know that these women with substance use issues that are unaddressed tend to go back to the offender more frequently. So it's harder for them to separate. And so, it's core business for the sector that's been currently really not addressed very well.
Thank you. We have a question from Troy.
Yeah, commenting on the same kind of theme, and I think one of the challenges that I've certainly found working in this field is the idea of talking about things that make victims vulnerable versus blaming victims. And I agree with you, Don, as well, about avoiding media generally. But that language, I'd be interested in anyone else's perspectives on the idea that there are things that make people more vulnerable without causing them to become victims, but you are more vulnerable in certain circumstances, and that's not to blame people, it's just the reality that is the case. And we need to be mindful of that when we're thinking about whether that's risk assessment, whether it's managing risks, whether it's helping people to escape violent situations, that there are, as Kathy says, vulnerabilities that people have. And we talk about vulnerabilities in any other context, and I think we also need to kind of get out there, and when people start blaming victims for being victims, we could hit it on the head and come at it pretty directly and say, like, that's not an acceptable way to talk about this.
It's a delicate balance, though, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, it's entirely true. In every other context, whether it's neighbourhood watch or whatever, we're always talking about what you can do to reduce your risk. At the same time, in this particular context, there's a real risk of people not thinking about this as a criminal offence, all right? That's a starting point. But how to solve that problem, I don't have any ready answers. I totally agree with Kathy that this issue needs to be addressed, and I can vividly remember the first time quite a few years back, I'm really old, When we first raised the issue of alcohol being an issue, the audience hissed, and we've come a long way since then. There's no question about it. But those risks of trivialising and victim blaming are still alive and well.
Any other questions, comments?
They're all desperate for a break.
Yeah, that's quite true. I just have to say this is probably the first time I've ever chaired a session where every presenter ran on time. So thank you very much for actually cutting your presentation to fit the 20 minutes brief. It's hard. We all know that. So thank you. And thank you for can we give a round of applause?
Thank you.
Speakers, please. And I'm hoping for all of our sake lunch is ready.